I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a lecture about the case Bowsher v. Synar, a U.S. Supreme Court case from 1986 about congressional removal powers. We're really talking about appointment and removal powers of the president, though this case usually goes in the chapter of a casebook or a course about executive branch controls over the agency or presidential controls. Now, a quick word for my students. I'm recording this video for my Statutory Interpretation and Regulation class, or Leg-Reg as it's called in some places, and because it's in the casebook. This is also a classic administrative law case, and so for many years I've actually taught the case in my administrative law class. In the newest edition of the casebook that I use in administrative law, this case was taken out and replaced with some newer cases. But many administrative law students will find this case useful or hear it talked about as well. So let's look at what happens in Bowsher v. Synar. So the critical question here, let's start with the main takeaway that you're supposed to get out of this case, is whether the role of the United States Comptroller General under the Balanced Budget Act violated the appointment and removal clauses of the Constitution. And Congress basically can terminate or fire the Comptroller General for certain specified reasons. These will sound familiar to some of you, including inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. That's sort of the standard trifecta that's put in a lot of federal statutes as appropriate grounds for removal of officials. The Balanced Budget Act was an attempt in the 1980s to force Congress to pass a balanced budget every year, to live within the means of the revenue, the federal government's revenue. It had bipartisan support. The idea was that since World War II, we had engaged in increasingly in deficit spending. And so the Balanced Budget Act was an attempt to kind of for the legislature to restrain itself. And of course, there's really nothing except politics that keeps Congress from passing a balanced budget any year, even without a rule saying that they have to. But what this did was it created some procedures to try to make it a little easier to do that, or maybe make it so that it was harder not to pass a balanced budget. And ultimately, the Supreme Court finds that this is unconstitutional. And it's because of the appointment powers, a problem. So this is the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act. That's the official name of the act, but you can remember it as a Balanced Budget Act. And what it did is it imposed phased-in caps on federal budget deficits intended to bring the deficit eventually to zero. In other words, it wasn't requiring a balanced budget the very next year. It was going to start reining in the budget and phase in more and more severe caps until we would really be done with deficit spending. This required across-the-board budget cuts, though, every year in a lot of different departments. And this is where two agencies that end up are not well known to the American public, but are pretty important from the standpoint of how the government actually works, come into play. So there's the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, that is in the executive branch and actually is across the street from the White House and works very closely with the president. And the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, which was created basically to be Congress's answer to the OMB. So this is within Congress. This is a legislative branch division, and that basically does a lot of the same stuff, budgetary analysis and spending analysis. And they would come up with proposed cuts and give them to the Comptroller General. Now, the Comptroller General would evaluate these reports from the OMB and the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, formulate his or her own conclusion, and then make a binding recommendation to the president. And that part is really crucial for this case, that the president didn't really have a choice or discretion about taking these recommendations. It was sort of a take it or leave it. The president couldn't say, no, 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 I need to preserve the budget of the military, or we need to save money for schools or police or whatever it was. Basically, the Comptroller General was going to tell the president what to do in terms of what programs would get cut. The president would have to order whatever cuts the Comptroller General recommended, unless Congress could agree on other cuts in the meantime. So here's now, all of that may sound like there's plenty to work with in terms of analyzing the legality of it, but what the court in this opinion focuses in on, and this is why we're really reading the case in my course, is this figure, this official, the Comptroller General, and how this person is appointed and potentially removed. So the president actually does appoint the Comptroller General, but the House and the Senate provide a short list of 3 finalists, and the president basically has to pick someone from that list. So this is very different from executive branch appointments, where the president can kind of pick whoever he or she wants, and usually gets recommendations from his or her own party. But here, the House and Congress basically get to narrow it down to 3 finalists, and then the president gets to pick one of those. For removal, it gets a little bit more complicated. The Comptroller General is removable only by impeachment or a joint resolution of Congress, which requires majority votes in both houses and is subject to presidential veto. In other words, the president can't fire this person, and can't even fire this person for cause, like we talk about in the Humphreys executor case. And so now the for cause impeachment means that this person can be removed for permanent disability, inefficiency, neglect of duty, malfeasance, or felony conduct involving moral turpitude. And by the way, just so you can picture who the names on the case are, although they're not that important personally, is Bowsher was the Comptroller General when this went to the Supreme Court. So that's Charles Arthur Bowsher in the bottom, and Congressman Mike Synar was actually the original plaintiff who challenged the Balanced Budget Act. I don't think out of a real concern about the appointment powers problem, but because of the drastic budget cuts that this was going to require, and the programs that were going to have to get scrapped and defunded. So the court found that the Comptroller General was carrying out an executive function. And so this part of the sort of functionalist approach also is in line with a line of cases that, like the Myers case and Humphreys executor, where the court would really look at what does this official do, or what are they doing here, at least, and does that look more like the legislature or like the executive? Normally, we don't worry about the Comptroller General because almost everything the Comptroller General does, apart from this act, is safely located within the legislature or the legislative branch. Technically, the Comptroller General is an employee of the legislative branch. So, but under the Balanced Budget Act, the Comptroller General was interpreting the act to determine what sort of budgetary adjustments were really necessary, and then basically commanding the president to implement all of his or her directives regarding budget resolutions. Now, at the same time, the majority of the court was troubled by the fact that Congress retained control over the Comptroller General, because it could remove the Comptroller General, albeit for cause, but not just impeachment. So remember that you could remove this person by impeachment or by a joint resolution, a majority vote from both houses. And so for an executive branch official, if Congress wants to fire someone in the executive branch, normally either the president can just fire the person, they serve at the pleasure of the president, or Congress can remove executive branch officials through an impeachment process. That wasn't required here. Justice Stevens wrote a concurrence here that we should just mention. You don't need to, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. He basically argued that the Comptroller General's function was actually really legislative, that this is in the eye of the beholder, not executive, but that the legislative role was too great and bypassed bicameralism and presentment. So he saw this as more like a Chadha, an INS v. Chadha problem. And so I do want to explain something just about this. The idea is, look at what this person is doing. And the majority in this case, the majority opinion says that this is an executive function because it involves implementing a statute and executing a interpreting it and figuring out how to apply it to policy decisions like cutting programs, and then sort of telling the president what to do. Justice Stevens thinks that what's happening here is really just budgetary, and that's an inherently legislative function. But what's happening here is you have one person who's getting to do the legislation instead of both houses of Congress having to debate and pass it separately, and then the issue goes and is subject to a presidential veto and so forth. So we've sort of consolidated all of the stuff that Congress would normally do in one person, and who can kind of act unilaterally. So he said that the Comptroller General was exercising legislative functions, so some congressional control was appropriate. He wasn't bothered by the fact that Congress can get rid of the Comptroller General. Also, he really thought that this was de minimis or a theoretical. The removal requirements of cause and a joint resolution of Congress and presentment to the president to remove the Comptroller General made it really nearly impossible to remove the Comptroller General in practice. In other words, this was never going to happen. And so he thought that this was really just a theoretical problem that the majority was hung up on. Now, let's just talk a little bit about where this leaves us. Let's talk about classification of the power. The Supreme Court justices disagree in a lot of these cases about whether a power or function is inherently legislative or executive. So it's one thing if different members of Congress disagree, but we can't even get the 9 members of the U.S. Supreme Court to agree on what is a legislative power or executive. And so if reasonable minds can differ, we have to ask the question as observers, is there really a right answer? Is there one right answer to this question? But the answer is, this is how we're deciding a lot of these appointment and removal power cases. Also, then this is something that the court doesn't really address, and this is the policy question about balanced budgets. If Congress could get the votes to pass a statute requiring balanced budgets year to year, why can't they get the votes to just balance the budget in any given year? Like, why can't they, if they can get the votes to make a rule we have to have balanced budgets, then why can't they get the votes to just balance the budget without making the rule? And I don't really have an answer to that question, except it's politics. Okay, that concludes our lecture about Bowsher v. Synar.